Welcome back to another episode of the Zag Talk podcast. I'm your host, Carson Hollyoak, and I'm joined, as always, by Brian Mary and Dylan Graff. We're here after the first weekend of the NCAA tournament, and it just shook out the way we all thought it would, right? We got Oral Roberts, the 15 seed in the Sweet 16. Loyola Chicago pulled the upset that everyone knew they would over Illinois. The Big Ten is pretty much out of the tournament outside of Michigan, so kind of a chalky tournament so far. Not too many surprises. But no, in all seriousness, it was a crazy first weekend. Gonzaga moved on to their sixth consecutive Sweet 16 appearance with a win over Norfolk State and then Oklahoma. We're just going to kind of do an overview of that Oklahoma game really quick, talk about some of the big highlights from the first weekend, and then move into our previews for specifically the Creighton game, and then give a little high-level overview of the two Pac-12 teams we might face in the Elite Eight. So with that, we'll get into it. Gonzaga's game against Oklahoma was one of those ones where, we were up by double digits for a decent amount of the second half and even the latter part of the first half. And it never really felt like it was super comfortable. Even when we got up by about 19 or 20 there midway through the second half, it was really kind of felt like it was in range. But maybe that's just us used to kind of double digits being our marker for whether we've played well or not in terms of beating teams. But Drew Timme was a stud that game. He kind of was the guy who enforced his will down the stretch that really kind of separated us. After kind of struggling in the beginning of the game with some of the pick and roll that they were running with Reeves, who was also a stud in that game. I know we'll talk about him in a little. But Anton Watson came off the bench and kind of slowed down that pick and roll. And from there, it was pretty much all Zags outside of a little push from Oklahoma at the end. But Timme ended with a career high, just all over the place. Jalen Suggs bounced back from more of an off game in the first game. And Kispert kind of just stuck with it. Not a huge first half, but, he was knocking down big shots. He kind of had a dagger towards the end of the game that really just put it away. So not much more you can ask for. It was a 16-point win, 17-point win, and moving on to the next round. You guys have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think the only other thing is we started off a little slow, not the normal quick acceleration into a lead that we've seen throughout the regular season. In our first round game kind of took off. But I think the guy who you didn't mention, and I think, had a relatively quiet game overall, but had a great first couple of minutes, especially when we did start off slow, was Ayayi. I think he hit 2 threes. He had 8 points in the first 10 minutes of the game. So really came out strong. I think that was really nice to see somebody else able to step up. Obviously when I say somebody else, it's still a main player on our team, but him and Nembhard keeping it together in the first half when Kispert did start off slow and Timme just hadn't gotten hot yet was a really nice thing to see as well.
Yeah, Anton Watson was for sure the X factor. He was able to create a little bit of havoc on the defensive end, and that definitely changed the complexion of the game. And I think it was really all about pacing. Oklahoma had done a really good job of kind of dictating the pace more than anything with their pick and roll. But I think from a high level standpoint overall, at the pace that they were playing at or the pace they seemed to want to play at, I don't know if any team in the country is going to outscore Gonzaga. This is one of the few games that we have been outshot, actually. They outshot us. We shot 49.1%. They shot 50% from the field. But just kind of goes to show it. When you get in a track meet with Gonzaga, it's really, really hard to compete. And Jalen Suggs, I thought he put it into fifth gear. It was unbelievable to see that. And he always, along with Drew Timme, both of those guys have always stepped up in those bigger games. So, I'm pleased with how they played. A 16-point victory against a Big 12, Big 12 team. It was very solid and makes me very optimistic for for what we're going to talk about later, which is the upcoming game against Creighton.
Yeah, I think the other thing from this game, and you hit on it, B. Mary, of like they came out and they wanted to run with us. And I just think if a team's going to beat us, that's not how you're going to go about doing it. You're going to have to slow the ball down. You're going to have to outshoot us, but with a lot less attempts, I think, and play a lot better defense against the Zags. And I think that's something in the tournament that's shown itself in other games as well, other teams. Teams have come out and seem to almost play to the other team's strength, I think, or come out and just be confused in what the other team is running. We saw it in both Syracuse games. Both SDSU and West Virginia came out in the first. For SDSU, it was the whole game, and for West Virginia, it was the first half of just like looked stunned by the fact that Syracuse was running a 2-3, and this Oklahoma team looked dog tired in the second half because they'd had to try to keep up with 7 Gonzaga players for the entirety of the game. And that's just really, really hard to do. So I think there's going to be some adjustments after the first weekend to, how to beat the really good teams that have played really well so far.
Yeah, that's a good point in terms of them being gassed. One of the guys that we kind of saw who was visibly just super gassed was Manic, who he had some things to say before that game that maybe came back to bite him in the ass a little bit. He had, they're beatable. We've played plenty of teams that are just as good as them, and we think we got a shot. And he kind of hit probably his worst game of the year. I didn't look at individual stats, but he had 3 points. Just got dominated down low whenever he was guarding Timmy. And I know they ended up playing their other big guy a lot more, who was great. He had like 5 blocks or something, but really just took him out of the game. Besides that first 3 that he hit in the first few minutes, then he was pretty much absent. So we did a good job of taking him out of there. And one thing that you mentioned with the pace in Syracuse, just with the zone, I'm kind of surprised looking through some of these teams that we might play, and we'll touch on in a little, is that more teams haven't tried a zone against us. And then I look at it and we're scoring almost like 1.3 points per possession against zone this year. I don't think it's been played against us that much, but I am kind of surprised we haven't seen that thrown our way a little bit, especially since we don't always shoot great, but teams just really don't seem to think that's the way to beat us. But nothing's been the way to beat us this year. So
sorry, real quick. I was looking at Eric Haslam's metrics and was looking at our worst performances of the year just now. And what's really interesting is you would think that when our opponents play faster, generally, that we would, fare better. But that's actually not the case. It's a little bit mixed. So our 5 worst performances have been Northwestern State, Santa Clara, West Virginia, Pacific, and Dixie State. Now, granted, a lot of these games were just straight up blowouts, but I really do think it's interesting that, Northwestern State, they rank 52nd in the nation in pace. So in the top kind of 8th of teams. Santa Clara, 59th. West Virginia, 101st. So that's kind of getting into the lower range. And then Pacific, who I thought played us the most consistently for a vast majority of our game against them at Pacific's home court. They rank 268th in pace. So it's not as if we play much worse against teams that are slower or much better against teams that are faster. It's kind of mixed. So, when looking at that, I'm curious to know if Oklahoma kind of was looking at that stuff too and figured, maybe the answer isn't to slow things down, because we saw how that went for Virginia, right? So I don't know, pretty interesting. Either way, just a really solid win. I was really pleased to see them, kind of get punched in the mouth early and come back. They just played really well. So I'm stoked for the Sweet 16.
I think we can hop over to some of the other first and second round games. And kind of some other storylines that have developed across the tournament. And then we can hop into some of our future reviews for the upcoming games as well. I think just one thing to note, there's 4 double-digit seed teams left in the Sweet 16. Number 11, UCLA. Number 15, Oral Roberts. Obviously, the Cinderella story so far. Number 11, Syracuse. And Pac-12 tournament champion, number 12, Oregon State. And I think that's just goes to show the amount of variables we've seen so far this year, and the top seeds that have gone down, with Illinois losing to probably vastly underseeded Loyola Chicago. If I'm Illinois, I'm probably pretty butthurt that I had to play Loyola Chicago in the second round, because that's a damn good team. And you look at the other teams that remain, Oral Roberts, and even in the round of 32, you had quite a bit of mid-major teams still left. So I think that it was a very well-balanced field as a whole going into this tournament. Obviously, you've got a couple of teams sitting at the top. I was majorly impressed by Baylor in their two games. I think they've looked really, really solid. I was worried. We've talked about it over the last couple of weeks. They just haven't looked great after coming out of their second COVID pause. They moved out of the range of like, okay, we can excuse it. They've been off for 2 weeks, and they've looked really, really solid. Their defenses look amazing. I don't think you can dribble it anywhere near any of their guards at the top, and they're going to get steals. So they're a really solid team. My top 5 teams remaining are in no particular order, except for that Zags and Baylor are 1 and 2. I would say Oregon, USC, and Loyola Chicago round out my top 5. What about you guys?
Mine, I agree. I have Zags and Baylor up top. Like you said, Baylor just seems like they've kind of gotten it back together defensively. Although I will say that I think Wisconsin was probably the best possible matchup for them to get their defensive confidence back up, because they do not handle pressure in the slightest. We saw that against Michigan when they were down by like 40 at one point this year. And then rounding out my top 5, I have Alabama, USC, and I do have Michigan, even though I dislike Michigan a lot. They've surprised me a little bit in terms of how well they've played since Livers has been out. And I know they have a few guys who have stepped up, namely Shanti Brown has been a stud and hitting some outside shots. So they look good. They had some tough games. LSU gave them a run for a while and they closed it out. And obviously with these teams, it's not necessarily the teams that I think are most likely to make the Final Four, but I would definitely have Loyola in there if that was the case. And they're right on the outside of mine. So Brian, how about you?
Yeah, mine are slightly similar, I think, to each of yours. And I did happen to kind of put mine just in order. Zags, Baylor, Alabama number 3. I've got Loyola Chicago 4 and Oregon 5. I think that Loyola Chicago just impressed me so much. And, we talk about the tournament. It's all about matchups. And what Loyola Chicago showed was that when they're going up against arguably the best player in the nation and an extremely solid big man, at least on the offensive end, in Kofi Coburn, they can hang and they can beat those teams. And I think that they're going to be a matchup problem for anyone, especially on the defensive end, and just how efficient their defense is. That's why I put them in there. I don't know if I think the only way that you can beat them is by playing more as a team. And that kind of plays into their hands. They're a really good team. They play really well together. So that's why I picked them. And then, Oregon, I mean, they showed their true colors. Like Chris Duarte, just extremely solid. 23 points, 7 assists, 3 rebounds in their game against Iowa, which was just an absolute shellacking. So those are my 5. I think the other prevailing narrative so far is just the difference in the levels of success between some of the major conferences around the country. The Big Ten entered the tournament with 9 teams, and we now have 1 left in Michigan. And there were some pretty embarrassing upsets, including, Oral Roberts over Ohio State, with Dwayne Washington kind of choking a little bit. Some other really bad beats as well. Maryland absolutely getting boat raced was just, not a good look. Same thing with Iowa. So, the Big Ten, it went from if you're not in the Power 5, you don't play anyone, to we're too battle tested. We all beat each other up, and that's why we didn't win. You can't have it both ways. I'm sorry, you just can't. You can't do that. So I hope that narrative is squashed now that we have the same amount of representation from the Big Ten and the Summit League, and we can put that to bed. The Pac-12, they've just been crushing it. Colorado's the only team that's no longer in the tourney. UCLA, they've won three straight to get to the Sweet 16 as an 11 seed, including a really tough and exciting win in the first 4 game against Michigan State, win over BYU. And so look, ultimately, I think that the Pac-12 is, they're busting some brackets, no doubt, but they're also just kind of competing against a narrative that the Pac-12 is weak. And I'll be honest, I'm a little bit of a victim of that myself. But what do you guys think? Is the Pac-12 better than we thought, or is it just kind of the tournament and this is kind of what happens? Teams that you don't expect to win.
I think they were a little bit discounted, although I got in some Twitter beef on Sunday or Monday where a Pac-12 fan was tweeting at, he was tweeting at Ken Pomeroy on Twitter about like, oh, you'll just do anything to say that the Pac-12 isn't good. And I just responded that, all 5 of the teams at the time that had moved on to the second round were in the top like 30, or 4 of the 5 were in the top 30 of Ken Pom's rankings. So it wasn't really like he was like, if you looked at his rankings, 4 of those teams should have been in the round of 32. And this guy really took that offensively, I guess. But just to say that, USC is ranked number 6 in Ken Pom, and Oregon's 17th, UCLA is 24th. And I know they've bumped up a little bit with some of their play here, but it's not like these teams analytically had been, bad on the year. They just don't get as much attention, and they weren't as battle tested in a Pac-12 that wasn't as good this year, top to bottom. So you don't have those marquee matchups. You don't have, the random upsets where you can get someone like Washington, who's unranked, beating somebody that's not as likely this year. But obviously, I think the way it shakes out, did I think that the Pac-12 was going to have an Elite 8 team, potentially a Final Four team? No, not at all. Did I think Oregon State was going to make a run and beat Oklahoma State? No, definitely not. But I mean, they're solid. I think the bigger story from the weekend was probably just how bad the Big Ten and how overrated the Big Ten was this year. I think that was probably the biggest difference between, perception versus reality compared to what the Pac-12 is. Because I do think the Pac-12 got some really good favorable matchups for them too. Like Oregon against Iowa was about a perfect matchup to beat Iowa, and USC playing Kansas while also shooting 60-some%, which was just a wild game. UCLA got Abilene Christian in the second round, and then Oregon State obviously was just, they're on fire right now. So nothing's really stopping them except for maybe Krutwig from Loyola.
Yeah, and I think my favorite stat so far, favorite factoid so far is WCC bottom dweller Portland has now beaten number 12 or Oregon State, Sweet 16 Oregon State at Oregon State earlier this year. So I think that's the other thing to say, that like a lot of those Big Ten teams that everyone hyped up, they all had losses, but I don't think any of them necessarily that I can think of off the top of my head had, looking at the top couple, had horrible losses. They all lost to each other. They all had losses, but nobody had that really, really bad loss that I think at least a couple of those Pac-12 teams have had this season. And I think it's just that a lot of them are turning it on at the end of the season, especially UCLA, Oregon, and Oregon State have really turned it on at the end of the season and going into the tournament. And that's just, I think, part of what happens when you get to the tournament. You have a fully healthy team or a mostly healthy team. I think the only other thing we wanted to talk about, or one of the only other things we wanted to talk about so far in first 2 round recaps, is just a couple of the guys to look out for, or guys that just had some phenomenal stat lines from a couple of games. I think you want to talk about the Cinderella team, the nation's sweetheart, Oral Roberts. I mean, they've got 2 guys averaging more than 24 points a game. Max Abmas is averaging 24-5, 3.5 with 2 steals. And Kevin O'Banner is averaging 27.5, 11 rebounds with 2.5 steals a game. So they've got guys that are just absolutely popping off for them. They look phenomenal. They have great wins. They're just really fun to watch. I find myself rooting, as I'm sure most of the country is, that as long as their team isn't playing Oral Roberts, is rooting for those guys to get wins. Buddy Boeheim, I'm sure you recognize the last name. Jim Boeheim's son over at Syracuse is averaging 27.5 a game. Johnny Juzang across 3 games for UCLA is averaging 22 and 4. Those are some guys that just have had some outstanding runs so far. Those guys all 3 of those are still in the tournament. All 3 of them averaging some really great numbers. And I think when you hop over to the individual performance side, I think you have to give a major shout out to the Eastern Washington man with the beard, not the mustache, Tanner Groves. My God, Eastern almost gets the upset in the first round of Kansas, which I did have. I was quite bummed to see Kansas pull away there at the end, but Tanner Groves had 35. He was 5 of 11 from 3, and they almost get the upset. That's pretty fucking amazing. And when you hop over to the Zags, and especially in the Oklahoma game, Drew Timme, 30, 13, and 4 in the win over Oklahoma. And I think hats off to Austin Reeves, who had 27, 2, and 2. The kid showed he could shoot the ball. I think he had 2 threes. And I think what impressed me the most was his floater game was phenomenal in that game. And he really kept Oklahoma. Obviously we won by 16, but he really kept Oklahoma within striking distance through the entirety of that game. And then the only other 3 I wanted to call out so far or the only other two I wanted to call out so far were Luka Garza had 36 and 9 in their loss to Oregon. And then Miles McBride flirted with, some people were saying going into the last 10 minutes, flirted with a triple double. He finished with 36 and 6, but probably had one of the most dominant first round performances for sure for West Virginia in their first round win, although they're out now. And then I didn't get a chance to watch the Oregon game, so I don't know if I know somebody put on here Chris Duarte as well.
Yeah, super impressive. He was in command the whole game. He was the leader for sure. 23 points, 7 assists. Not much more to say. He crushed it.
And then last bit of news before we go into Creighton and the Creighton matchup, I should say. Walker Kessler from University of North Carolina, who was a highly touted 5-star recruit last year, averaged about 8 minutes a game this past year, 9 minutes a game, averaged 4 and 2, didn't play a ton, but has entered the transfer portal along with everybody else in the NCAA that is not still in the tourney. But I think that's a conversation for another day. But obviously, Zags, being the transfer market that they are in the front running, and we were in the front running in the first case in his recruitment coming out of high school as well.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting with him. The more that's come out about it, it sounds like this has kind of been known in the inner circles at Gonzaga that he would be transferring since around February. And obviously we were one of his final schools that he was deciding between. And I don't think he was super happy with playtime there. I think I saw something that Tate from, Titus and Tate, that he had said that he really didn't play that much. And then I think this coaching staff realized that he was unhappy with his playtime and might be leaving. And so then they just tried to play him a shit ton at the end of the year. And that doesn't really do you a whole lot of good. So it would be an interesting fit next year with him. I think he's probably ahead of where Ballo would be, but you never know with off seasons and who's going to stay, who's going to go. But it never hurts having the depth and another 5-star on the roster, another 7-foot+ guy. So exciting news. And as we know, we got Hunter Salas commitment coming up on Friday, and then hopefully Chet soon as well. So exciting time in the recruiting and transfer world. All right, let's hop into our previews, starting off with the Sweet 16 with Creighton. Creighton got to this round by beating upset favorite UCSB in the first round. Really almost lucky at the end there, as UCSB had a shot that rimmed out right at the end. Some UCSB fans and people pulling for the upset might have thought there was a foul as well, or could have been a foul there at the end, but got through that and then really handled Ohio, never really let Preston get going at all. So they kind of looked like they returned to form offensively in that last game, but they're 22-8 on the season. They finished a half game back of Villanova in the Big East regular season at 14-6, but they did lose by 25 to Georgetown in the Big East championship during that Georgetown run. After they looked really good in a game against a tight game against UConn the game before. We know that they have some controversy with their coach, Greg McDermott, towards the end of the season, where he was suspended for a game and came back. Wasn't really sure how the team would respond, and they seem to be playing well now. So just a lot going on with them over the last month or so of the season. Statistically, they're 19th in KenPom with the 24th ranked offense and 32nd ranked defense, and a tempo at around 143rd in the country. So they run at a decent pace. It's not quite as fast as Gonzaga, but they will get up and down, and they do some interesting things out of transition as well. Their bread and butter, they love the three-point shot. Everybody on their team can shoot it except for maybe one or two of the big guys. They shoot just under 37% from three, but 44% of their shots come from three, with 41% coming from mid-range. So they're shooters, and you'll see that just in the personnel and the overall height. They don't really have true big men. Their tallest guy's 6'7", so it's really guard oriented and moving around. Lots of off ball movement and pick and rolls, dribble handoff. But as I kind of touched on, where they've picked it up offensively, they really were struggling going into the tournament, where they ranked 92nd in adjusted offensive efficiency in the last 30 days leading into the tournament. So just hadn't really figured it out there. They're a terrible free throw shooting team, which is really surprising for a team that can shoot it like they can, especially their best shooter, Balak, however the hell you say it. It seems like a really simple name, but I've heard it pronounced like 3 different ways over the weekend. But he shoots like 42% from three, and shoots 52% from the free throw line. So I guess if there's ever a time that you foul a three-point shooter, this would be the game, and he would be the guy to do that. Other than that, they don't turn the ball over a lot, so that's something to look for. As we know, Gonzaga likes to turn teams over and get out in transition to get the pace up. They're fairly efficient around the basket. They shoot 63% within 5 feet, but they only shoot 15% of their shots from there. So like we said before, 3-point heavy, jump shot heavy team. They do like to get out in transition, though, and they will look for Balak on the sideline for corner threes in transition. And then we kind of know the story with Zagorowski. He's kind of their go-to guy. He's their highest usage guy. He'll run in pick and rolls. If he gets hot from three, you got to watch out, because he can really heat up really fast, which we saw against Ohio. And we talked about the size advantage. There are power forward and center positions ranked 78th percentile in the country, whereas Creighton's bigs are in the 18th percentile. So huge height advantage. I think they have one guy that comes off the bench who plays about 13, 14 minutes that is 7 feet, but he's super raw. Think about like Zakharov, but like last year and a little more gangly. And that's kind of what that guy reminds me of. But I'll let Brian go into more of the personnel and kind of hit on each of their main guys. They only play 5 guys over 30 minutes. They make up over 3/4 of their minutes. And there's 3 guys off the bench who are playing about Julian Strother, Dom Harris minutes. So you're going to get the same 5 guys. They can run, they can play, and that's about it. So Brian, I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. Yeah, overall, I mean, there's one guy you got to watch out for. Marcus Zagorowski is by far their best player. It's not even a question. And he's, well, their scoring is fairly balanced if you take a look at it. So they got Marcus Zagorowski. He comes in at around 15.5 points per game. Damian Jefferson, who he plays the 2 guard. He comes in at 12.1 points per game. Denzel Mahoney, really, really long, lanky wing. He'll put up 12 points a game. But even though he's really long, he's got a 6'11" wingspan, fairly tall. He doesn't really finish well at the rim, which is kind of weird. He shoots 33% from 3, 37% from mid-range. So Not sure. Kind of a wild card there. Christian Bishop, he's their big. He's 6'7", so he's not enormous. But he finishes a lot better at the rim. Close to 70%. He'll bring in probably around 10.8 points per game. And then Ballack is who rounds out their starting five, and he'll contribute about 10 a game. So yeah, ultimately, as Carson said, like a vast majority of their minutes are coming from their starters, and that's really going to make up a majority of of who we're going to see. Then obviously they have the 7-footer coming off the bench. I wouldn't expect too much out of him. They might play him a little bit more than what they might normally play him, just to get some fresh legs in there against a guy like Drew Timme, who's going to be fed a lot. So yeah, ultimately that's kind of their team. But everything, as I said, just kind of runs through Zegarowski. He's a shooter and a playmaker. He shoots 41% from three. And once he gets hot, that's kind of all she wrote. Now, with that said, it's not just that he needs to get hot. Like the other guys need to contribute too. And I think if you watch the Georgetown game, that was pretty apparent because he was very efficient. He was, I believe, 7 of 8 from the field. Not sure on his total points, but the rest of his team didn't contribute at all, really. I think the rest of the team combined for a total of 10 makes. So yeah, that kind of tells you how it would go if Zegarowski's the only guy who can make plays. I do want to call out one stat before we talk through kind of how they play and their sets and things like that. On KenPom, in terms of average possession length, on offense, they rank 42nd in the nation. So top 50 is pretty fast. But on defense, they rank 328th, meaning they force their opponents to have really long possessions, which is really interesting to me. And I think to me, that signals that they're a really good basketball team that really can kind of dictate the pace on both ends, which is really hard to do. It's something Gonzaga can do. They kind of showed that against Oklahoma, but yeah, it'll be an interesting matchup. And I don't think they'll be able to contain us as well in transition, but it seems like once they force a team to play in the half court, they force those teams to spend a vast majority of that shot clock up. So those are kind of my thoughts there.
Yeah, and one thing too, you talk about their defense that I didn't touch on earlier is that this probably plays a part in that they're really good in ball screen defense. They only give up 0.76 points per possession on pick and rolls. And even post-ups too, they don't have a lot of big guys like we talked about, but they're only giving up 0.78 points per post-up. So kind of an interesting thing. It's probably the best defensive team that McDermott has had at Creighton before, and maybe even going back to former positions that he's had. He's never been known as a super defensive-minded coach, but I could definitely see this game just on the way that it looks like they want to play is fast offensively, and we've seen when teams get into that with Gonzaga that it's really tough to slow it down after you get them going, and if you're going fast on one side, it's super tough to keep it slowed down on the defensive end. So something to watch for. It could just kind of be fireworks in terms of the offense in this game. But I think some of the matchups are going to be pretty interesting too. We talked about inside with Bishop, who's not the biggest guy, but he's pretty athletic. He doesn't look like a 6'7" guy when he's playing. But I mean, if he gets into foul trouble, we know Timme is great at drawing fouls, and we're probably going to be hammering the ball inside. That they're pretty shallow on the bench. And I don't think that the freshman off the bench is going to be able to do much against Timme. So something to watch out there. Mahoney, who's the wing with the 6'11" wingspan, he's 6'5", so a little undersized playing against someone like Kispert, but that's kind of where I imagine he'll match up, just because he has the length and the athleticism to kind of stick on him and not let him get open looks. And I think the one that we can attack is going to be Ballack. He's not the quickest guy. And I think wherever that is, if we're getting him in pick and rolls on switches or whatever it might be, could be a place to attack, obviously, other than inside. But yeah, going into what they do on offense, a lot of what they do, obviously there's the pick and roll and kind of isolations for Zagorowski. He's, like you said, Brian, the main guy. They're setting up everything kind of for him, but they do run a lot of sets to get Ballack open for threes. They use what we call a veer screen to get him open. So pretty much this is, kind of a guy runs up to go set a ball screen and then pretty much doesn't set the screen and immediately goes and screens off ball on Ballack's guy who's coming off of the screen for a shot. And then they have a few counters off of that. If he rejects it, he's coming off another screen on the other side. So constantly screening, kind of like what we saw with Iowa, where there's just a lot of off-ball motion. The only difference is you don't have a Garza on the inside. They actually go 5 out pretty often. The other thing they like to do, they have a lot of dribble handoffs with 3 guards up at the top of the key. It's kind of dribble handoff, cut, screen, dribble handoff again. And what they'll do to get Ballack open as well when they're really trying to get him going is they'll run a pick and roll going away from Ballack on to the opposite side of the floor, get the defense shifting into help in their rotations, and then they immediately reverse the ball back to Ballack off of a screen and have him coming off a screen. And the issue, either off the screen or they have the guy driving right at the defender, and they really force the defense to decide if they're going to help down on a drive, which isn't going to have deeper help in the key, or if they're going to stick to Ballack, which is probably the best way to go because he's going to knock those down at a really high clip. So that's what you got to look out for, is we really got to be disciplined on our no help defense on Ballack. Give up those layups that are probably going to be contested. And if they beat us off the dribble, give them the 2 instead of letting him get hot from 3. Like I said, kind of like Iowa in that way, where you really want to shut down the threes. Don't let them get hot, because that's where they get their momentum. If they're just getting to the hoop, they don't like to shoot around the rim, and they don't shoot a lot near the rim. Like we said, 15% of their shots are at the rim. So it's kind of that fake drive just to kick it out and get those open looks. But there is a lot of movement. You can't fall asleep defensively. You got to stick with your man. And there's just a lot of screening actions and crossing actions to keep up with.
So would your recommendation be that we kind of like we talked about when we previewed Iowa, we should just try and make them drive to the basket and that's, get them uncomfortable in that way, instead of being able to get kickouts for 3?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest way that they're going to hurt you and be able to keep up with Gonzaga offensively, is if they're shooting threes. Like I said, it's not like they shoot a poor percentage inside around the hoop, but their preference is to not do that. They'll rather pull up and shoot a mid-range jumper or kick it back to a guy kind of cutting for a mid-range jumper or 3. So, yeah, but you really do with Ballack, you got to stay on him because he will shoot from anywhere. He'll shoot kind of fading away. He'll shoot off the dribble, and they'll find him wherever. Besides Zagorowski, I think, you're giving up those drives to the lane with maybe less help than you would like to see. But we kind of see us do that sometimes anyway, and we just take it, get it out, and get going and get our offensive pace up. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's where they're really going to hurt us, is from 3. And we've seen that happen to us before against BYU in the start of the Oklahoma game, where teams have shot the hell out of the ball, but it's just really hard to, keep that up for 40 minutes while we're keeping up our scoring like we do. So,
yeah. And I think also to re-highlight too, Mahoney, you mentioned at the top, he is a good scorer. He's averaging 12.5 a game, but he's not a good finisher. He's shooting 46% at the rim. And you look at Ballack, who is finishing at 70% at the rim, but he's barely taking any attempts from there. So isn't a high volume scorer at 70% from the rim. And then the fact that they're a terrible free throw shooting team, both a couple of guys individually, especially like you pointed out, Ballack has not been a good free throw shooter this year, and the team as a whole. I think all of that points towards force him inside. We're playing great help defense, so you get guys to force the ball inside. Watson had 2 double downs in help that turned into either a jump ball or a straight up turnover in the Oklahoma game. So I think this team is really the Gonzaga team is really well suited to hopefully shut down a team like Creighton and be able to pull away from a team like that, as long as you're not letting them shoot threes.
Yeah, and I think this is where having Nemhard eligible is really huge too, because the way that we're running a small ball starting lineup anyway. And you could even throw in Watson for Timmy to give him a breather in this game, because they don't have that big body big who's going to back you down in the post. But like, they're running out 4 guards, and normally you'd be with our normal starting lineup at the beginning of the season with Watson and Timmy, and it's like, okay, well, who's going to guard Ballack, who's going to guard Mahoney, Jefferson? Like, they can all shoot it. Whereas now it's kind of, I mean, it's really a perfect scenario in terms of matchups for us on the defensive end, where our guards are all around the 6'3" to 6'5" range. Theirs are the same. And then the difference is that we have almost 7-footer, 6'10" guy in Drew Timmy in the post, and then an athletic big that comes off the bench that probably matches up pretty well with Bishop as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think they're a tough team, and I think it will be a good game because they're a really good offense, and their defense isn't anything to stick your nose up at either. But it just really seems like a really good matchup for us in terms of the style of play and the lineups.
Yeah, I was curious just now to take a look at if there have been any sort of similar matchups in terms of like defensive players from the Big East. And how our guys compare on the defensive end. I just hopped over to Evan Miyakawa's site. Our entire starting lineup, if they were ranked for defense in the Big East, they would be 3 through 7 in terms of total defensive efficiency. And the guys who are 1 and 2 are Ike Obiagu or Ike Obiagu, who's 7'2". So definitely not guarding a guy like Zagorowski or Ballack on the perimeter. And 6'9" Isaiah Whaley from UConn. So in terms of matchups on the defensive end, if I was Creighton, that would be my biggest concern. You're not like, you haven't faced a team as athletic or as efficient on defense. And just from player to player, I think that would be my biggest concern is if I was Creighton. I'll quickly talk about the USC Oregon matchup because they've already got lines out and everything. USC is favored by 2.5 points. Obviously, the headline there is Isaiah Mobley. He's potentially the number 1 overall pick in the NBA draft. Just
Evan Mobley.
Evan Mobley. That's my bad. My bad. The brothers.
Yeah.
Evan Mobley, just an incredible athlete. Prototypical NBA player for sure. Overall, look, it's going to be it's really going to be a solid game. Obviously, USC and Oregon have already faced off a few times this season. Just some strengths and weaknesses from their previous matchups. Actually, due to COVID, it looks like they only played once. My apologies. USC won 72-58. It seems like Oregon has kind of bounced back and is starting to play much, much better basketball in the latter half of the season. And the score was 43-22 at halftime. USC just kind of blew the doors off them. USC shot 47% from 3. They out-rebounded Oregon by 14 rebounds, including by 6 offensive rebounds. Taj Edey led the team with 24 points, the transfer from Santa Clara. Duarte was only held to 11 points. And so that could be a big X factor. If Duarte isn't able to go off or play even close to his potential, then USC could run away with it. And so ultimately, well, Carson, do you want to go into kind of the metrics behind what USC does and what Oregon does, and we can talk about who we'd want to face?
Yeah, for sure. And I will just a quick comment on that first matchup. It was when Richardson was back in the lineup, which was kind of around when we saw Oregon kind of bounce back. He joined them back on the 4th of February in their Washington State game. But this was Oregon's only loss in their last 11 regular season games in the Pac-12, but they really did get walloped by USC. It was not really close. And this is kind of where we talked about with matchups in the tournament. Oregon looked great against Iowa, had a better win, I think, against a higher quality opponent than USC did against Kansas, who they smacked the crap out of Kansas as well. But matchup wise, this is kind of USC's matchup, the way it works out. USC is the better team in Ken Palm. They're sixth in Ken Palm, as we touched on at the top, with the 15th ranked offense and the 5th ranked defense. So they're a pretty solid team defensively. They're 236th in tempo. They shoot 36% from three, which might be shocking to you if the only game you watched of them this year was that Kansas game where they shot like 60% from three. That is not their normal, what they normally do. They usually only attempt 31% of their shots from three on the season. So kind of an anomaly, but when you're on, you're on. Kind of like Creighton, they're not a great free throw shooting team. They shoot 65% on the season. So that's definitely kind of a glaring issue for them as they get into some of these bigger games. Kind of not a shock with the personnel that they have with Mobley and his brother, and just the overall height of the roster, is that they're one of the better offensive rebounding teams in the country, where they grab 36% of missed shots. But kind of, again, surprising based off the Kansas game, they only have one player who shoots 38% or better from three. So really weird with them. They have length. If we talk about their roster, they match up against Oregon, who I'll touch on in a little height wise. Mobley, the Evan Mobley, who's future top 3, top 4 pick, 7-footer, super lengthy. His brother Isaiah Mobley is 6'10", and he actually didn't play in the first game against Oregon, so they smacked him without him. Edie, like we said, Santa Clara transfer, he's 6'2". But besides that, they have a 6'1" guy, and everybody else is 6'6" or taller. And they do play quite a few guys. But yeah, I mean, they have 2 more 6'8" guys, a 6'7" guy, 6'9", and then a 6'6" guard who you probably didn't see against Kansas because he has tended not to play against some of the more athletic teams because he's not the fleetest of foot. So, but that's the big thing with them that could cause matchup issues with us, is just that they have a ton of length. And they're a great defensive team that they can really kind of disturb what your offense likes to do. And then just another note here in the Kansas game is that the Mobley brothers combined for 27 points, 21 rebounds, 9 assists, and 4 blocks. So they're definitely, you got to stop them. But the weird thing with USC this year too is that they've won good games when Evan Mobley, their star player, has, not done anything super special in terms of scoring. He's just kind of there. He's all around. He's a great defensive player. I believe he was just named a finalist for the Naismith Defensive Player of the Year. So yeah, I think we'll move into Oregon here, but I think they are probably better suited in this game to win. And I think they're better set up to give Gonzaga more of a challenge than Oregon would. And we can kind of touch on our opinions on that after we go through Oregon really quickly here, who's 17th in Ken Palm, 10th ranked offense and 52nd ranked defense. So slightly better offense than USC, but their defense is, lacking a little bit. They're 227th in tempo, which again, if you watch their round of 32 game, you would be shocked that was the case because they will run up and down if they're given the opportunity. And they're just a great 3-point shooting team. They shoot 38% from three, but they have 4 guys, I believe, who are shooting over 38% from three, if I'm remembering correctly. Yes, Duarte, Amarui, Figueroa, and Richardson. I don't know if I butchered half of those names, but they're all over 38%. Duarte shooting 43% from three. They, kind of like Gonzaga, score a lot of points off of turnover, almost 18 per game. And then kind of the big thing with them that I kind of hinted at during USC is their height. If you thought Creighton didn't have a lot of height in terms of big guys, Oregon is kind of right on par with that. 6'6" for Duarte. Richardson is 6'5". Figueroa is 6'6". Amarui 6'6". Williams Jr. 6'6". And then 2 guys off the bench are Hardy and Lawson, who are 6'2" and 6'8" respectively. They lost their 6'11" big man in December to a torn ACL. So a lot of height. for a whole entire lineup, but not a lot of height inside, which is why someone like Garza was able to score 36 points, but their kind of slower, less athletic guards struggled against that length. So that's kind of their thing. They love to shoot the three. They don't really run a whole lot of ball screens. It's really off ball and cuts, and then they're looking to get out and shoot in transition and shoot the three on isolations, cuts to the hoop. The other thing to touch on is that they do play zone in about a quarter of their defensive possessions, which is super high relative to other teams, and obviously from what we've seen. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, that Gonzaga has done really well against zones. We saw that against Iowa and how we kind of just cut that up. So it'll be interesting to see if they do try that out. I wouldn't be surprised if they throw it at us just to try to slow us down a little bit. But it hasn't been super effective against Gonzaga so far this year.
One thing that is interesting to me about Oregon in particular is just that they're fairly experienced. And I'm not sure if these numbers are adjusted on KenPom, but they ranked 29th in experience this year, which is pretty dang good. They're the most experienced team in the tournament still. And I think, you might look at that and it might give you a little bit of pause. Obviously, experience isn't everything. The most experienced team in the nation is Nicholls State. but when it comes to the tournament, you've got to believe that having a few years under your belt, more college games, under your belt, puts you in a better position to succeed. Now, can Evan Mobley neutralize that just alone? Potentially. He's just that good. So it'll be a really cool matchup to watch, and I look forward to watching it and seeing who will face in the Elite Eight.
Yeah, I think the other thing, one note for both those teams, both USC and Oregon. So on the USC side, and actually similar to Creighton, not a good free throw shooting team. That's going to bode well for Gonzaga, any team we play that plays that way. There was a lot of people chirping on Twitter after the Oklahoma game that Gonzaga had a lot more free throw attempts and a lot less fouls called on them. And I think part of that turns to style of play. I mean, the team that attacks the basket more is going to get more free throws. That's just the nature of basketball as a whole. And I think if you get into a battle like that, when you get to the tournament, we've seen some games have been pretty whistle happy so far. Some games more than others, obviously, but depending on what refs you get, like if it becomes a free throw battle, it bodes well for us if we're playing a team like Creighton or USC that doesn't shoot the ball nearly as well, and we're going to get more attempts than them. So that's going to bode really well for us. And on the Oregon side, the fact that they don't play amazing transition defense is also really good as well. So I think they've been allowing 14 points per game in transition. So it's bottom quartile of college basketball, and that bodes really well for a team like Gonzaga who really wants to push the ball, get the ball out in transition. They did it really, really well against Oklahoma. Obviously, we had that highlight play by Suggs and Ayayi in the first round game where Ayayi threw it off the backboard to Suggs, which was quite entertaining. So when you play a team like that, that's going to be something the Zags are definitely going to want to take advantage of.
Yeah, I mean, the exciting thing here, too, that I guess we didn't really touch on is the West Coast. We're almost guaranteed. I mean, if Gonzaga moves on, we're guaranteed to have a West Coast matchup in the Elite Eight, and it could be a Pacific Northwest matchup. So, yeah, I'm really excited for it. I think there's some really interesting potential matchups with either of those teams if Gonzaga is able to handle Creighton in the Sweet 16, just in terms of height and shooting, or lack of height for Oregon, and just the defense with USC. They're very different teams that I think when I've watched them, that I've kind of just, grouped them in with the Pac-12 and haven't really paid too much attention to them now. And they're really solid teams that can really hurt you. And when you're hot, you're hot. And both those teams are playing really well right now, as we saw on Sunday and Monday. So hopefully it works out well for us.
Who do you guys got winning the Oregon USC game, and a counter to that, who would you like to win so that if the Zags win their game, they'd be playing the next game?
I think USC is going to win, and I would rather play Oregon. I just think we match up a lot better with Oregon, and I think USC is the better team, just all around. So yeah.
Same. What scares me a little bit about USC is just, their athleticism and their height. Those are things you can't teach, and I think we would definitely match up better with Oregon. Although I would love to see an Evan Mobley Drew Timme matchup. That would just be one for the ages. So either way, I think we've got a really, really good shot to slide past them. But I would much rather see Oregon than USC.
I'm in the same boat as you guys.
All right, so that's it for this episode of the Zag Talk podcast. We will be back later this weekend or early next week, hopefully before our Elite Eight game, if we're moving on to touch on a recap of the Creighton game and hopefully some exciting recruiting news with Hunter Salas's commitment coming up. Until then, give us a follow on Twitter at Zag Talk, and we'll throw in Brian and Dylan's Twitter accounts as well. And yeah, go Zags.
Go Zags.
Go Zags.